Fergus Hodgson is the founder and director of Econ Americas, a columnist with Epoch Times, a research associate with the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Previously, he was the founding editor-in-chief of PanAm Post and director of fiscal policy studies with John Locke Foundation. He studied economics at Boston University, political science at the University of Waikato, and Cuban history at the University of Miami. He grew up on a sheep and cattle farm in New Zealand and is also a citizen of Canada and Ireland. He has lived in Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, and Guatemala, and I think he's currently living in the US. He is a prolific writer on issues to do with Latin America, something I always look forward to. The topic of his speech is Painful Truths About Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fergus Hodgson.
I just want to say thanks to Jayant. It's a great privilege to speak with you all, and many of my intellectual heroes have been here. Jan Narveson was one, and John Hunt and Doug Casey, their two books, which are both out. I've read and reviewed them. They are excellent, and they have another one coming out in a couple of months. So, Painful Truths About Latin America. Why is this painful? I may have rattled some cages, although some people before me got us really started, so it's hard to beat them in that regard. But so it's painful. That's why I want to talk about them, because it's awkward for us to say the truth often. It hurts people's feelings. But I prefer that we be honest about it, because until you face up to your challenges or your problems, you're not going to resolve them. And, okay, so another reason, not only are these truths or realities just important in terms of resolving them, in terms of people in the Anglosphere, everyone knows, we've just had a discussion about racism and open borders. The realities of Latin America are coming to Anglo-America, and be it through migration or trade, whatever, we're going to be more integrated. That's a fact of life, so we have to get used to that and adapt to it. And so I want to address three sections. What are these problems or challenges, and why are they so persistent? And then what are the implications for the Anglosphere, or for the people who are basically engaging with Latin America? And for those who are unfamiliar, Latin America, simply the parts of the continent of the Western Hemisphere colonized by the Portuguese and Spanish. If you include Puerto Rico, that's 20 countries. And one man here has been to all of them, so he's beaten me. I've not been to Bolivia. Where is he, Mike? Anyway, so he was here last night. But so within those countries, there is a great deal of variability, obviously. However, they carry the same stamp or mark of their colonizers. And so what are these truths, right? Or what's the painful truth? Really, there's just one. And this was put best by a great author, Carlos Rangel of Venezuela. In 1976, he wrote that Latin America is a failure. And he said that the ocean could rise up and cover Latin America, and the rest of the world would barely notice. And his concern was that, how do we address this challenge? And he wrote a great book, From the Good Savage to the Good Revolutionary. Like I said, it was in 1976, and little has changed since that time. And so, so what are the challenges? One of the problems with addressing these is that we can't really rely on the conventional academic community or regular press. If you do that, you're getting the CBC or the Huffington Post version of reality. And that doesn't mean there are no ways to address this, but one good example, which Adrian Day touched upon, is this use of the word genocide. If you know Guatemala, all these American academics think there was a genocide there in the 1980s. If you live in Guatemala, nobody's talking about it. Nobody knows about it. The president doesn't think there was a genocide. The top historian doesn't think there was a genocide. The only people who think there was a genocide are a bunch of Marxists who are angry they lost the war with the government, and the US academics who obviously are on the side of the Marxists. So there are many other examples like this. One of the striking ones is from Nicaragua. That was a time when you had a pro-US ally, Anastasia Somoza, who was a firm US ally, even helped the US try to resolve the Cuba crisis. and yet the U.S. diplomats and the U.S. media were against him. And right now, a very recent case of misrepresentation is surrounding the Guatemala and U.S. or Trump administration agreement. This is a win-win for both countries, and yet if you follow the press, or you follow even U.S. officials, they'll say this is some sort of corrupt deal. So once we get past that, there are good writers on this topic, and people who have mentored me. Many of them are exiles. So Jose Azel, a Cuban exile, he's one of my great mentors. And then the founder who worked with me on the PanAm Post, Luis Enrique Ball. Both of them have some business experience, which will not surprise this audience, so they're a bit more practical or realistic than the academic world. So in terms of why, when we say that Latin America is a failure, we can use lots of numbers. I don't want to put too many out there, but just one. If we combine, or a few numbers, but one basic statistic, if we combine Canada and the United States in terms of economic activity, we get about $23 trillion per year, GDP. And in Latin America, if we combine all these countries, 4 to 5. And we have about twice the population in that part of the world. So basically we're saying that this entire region of the world with about 600 million people has 1/10 the GDP per capita. And that's not even including Cuba, actually, because Cuba would make it worse, although it's a small population, but there's no GDP data for there. And that's inflating Venezuela, because right now there's no GDP data for Venezuela, given the hyperinflation. So, but beyond that basic statistic, that this is not a trivial difference. If one area of the world is 90% less productive in its economy, there's a big problem there that needs to be resolved. And even if people don't want to admit this, if you go to Latin America, people don't really verbalize it. They don't say it, but their actions do, right? So when people leave, the Salvadoran president recently noted that one of the greatest maybe castigations or rejections of your homeland is to just up and leave and say, I'm not going back. You know, I have no confidence in my future. Actions speak louder than words. And so when people up and leave, they're saying, we don't believe in us, in our country. But it's not just in terms of migration. And when it comes to, say, education, I started a program in Guatemala at the Libertarian University. Maybe many of you have heard of it, Francisco Marroquin. It is just rife with cheating, plagiarism. Everybody knows this. None of the people in Guatemala are surprised by this. Anyone who's got money, you go elsewhere because you trust Western or Anglo institutions much better than your own. And even investment. People in many of these countries don't want to invest in their own countries, they send it abroad. So their actions speak much louder than their words. Okay, so there's actually and of the people who do vocalize and who deny the challenges of Latin America, this is best found in Argentina. Because Argentina is almost like, it's basically a post-First Nation or a post-developed nation, right? So a century ago, it was in the top, let's say, half dozen countries in the world in terms of development, of economic progress. People were going there. And now it's out the back door, right? So there's actually a film made about this called Argentina in Therapy, which describes the fact that Argentina, or specifically Buenos Aires, is the psychotherapy capital of the world. Right, there are more psychologists and people with need counseling than anywhere else in the world in Buenos Aires. And why is this? Because they have this assumption that they're a first world nation like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, where I'm from, and yet they look around them and they say, actually, you know, things aren't going so well. Right, there's this confusion, there's this awkwardness, and facing up to reality is difficult. Okay, so the question is then, why has this come to be? And like I said, why has this book written in 1976, before I was born, why has so little changed? You know, why is it stuck this way? And there are many books have been written on this. The question then is, so the big red herring is that this is somehow the United States' fault. And actually, there is a little grain of truth to this, of course, because U.S. officials have been belligerent in places or inefficient. And as maybe I explained a little before, a lot of U.S. officials, they're government people. So obviously they're leftists or they're confused. They're not necessarily productive. So, however, this is a big distraction from the fact on the ground. And I remember thinking this when I was living in southern Argentina in Patagonia, and you would see graffiti saying basically, off with the gringos, or basically attacking, at that time it was the vulture funds. And you think to yourself, okay, so Argentina was having an economic crisis. Some crazy people decided they would loan money to Argentina, not a good idea from my perspective. Argentina could not pay them back, and suddenly it's the Americans' fault. This was the reality. So, and you cannot blame the United States for these challenges. I mean, one example is in Central America. Like, I lived in Guatemala for a few years. Child marriage is still a major issue, right? So this is a big barrier to development. There are too many children. Basically, there's a subsistence level of existence. And about a quarter of women from Nicaragua up through El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala are married before they're 18. Now, I don't think anyone can say that the United States went down there and forced these people to get married so young. It's a cultural trait. And in terms of showing by actions, people sending their money abroad, going abroad for education, and then leaving, one of the key reasons is that, and this hurts me because I've spent so much time in Latin America and dealt with these challenges, is the low trust society. Now, I was in Paraguay, and I mentioned to people, some people here will know a man called Don Brash, who used to be Reserve Bank Governor of New Zealand. He was the opposition party leader, the National Party, and it came out that he had an affair. And so he was embarrassed about this or ashamed, and he resigned. He left Parliament. When I told this to people in Paraguay, they just, they thought it was hilarious. Everyone in their parliament has an amante, which means a lover, and their president, Fernando Lugo, for 4 years, their president, was a former bishop who had had multiple illegitimate children, including with a 16-year-old, and he got elected. And he's still in the Congress. He's a senator now. So their level of a tolerance for dishonesty is just, a different level. Let's just put it that way. And so they're aware of this, and this is the challenge of dealing with these countries, that the low trust society, which I think is just crippling to their development because they so desperately need investment. Okay, so like I said, we can admit the U.S. has contributed problems, or contributed. However, it's not a deciding factor. So we come down to the policy explanation. So we might say that Latin American countries are so wedded to socialism, and they've got all this corruption in government, and that's a fact that many of these countries are socialist. We all know this. However, there are many counterexamples to this, actually. First, which country do you think in the world has the lowest percentage of GDP as a share, government as a share of the GDP? It's actually Guatemala, around 15%. The Guatemalan government is very small. I'm not saying they spend that 15% wisely, but it's a very small share of the economy. And yet, do we see Guatemala flourishing? Is business going crazy there? No, of course not. And it's the same in Paraguay, actually. They have very low taxes. It's a very open economy. They actually have open borders with Uruguay, I'm sorry, with Brazil and Argentina at the Iguazu Falls. They have enormous amount of trade in between, and yet it is not developing. So also, if we want to say that these governments are corrupt or socialist, that's really a symptom of a problem, because we could drop a bomb on the Congress of Guatemala or Paraguay, or not those two countries, but let's say we want to go to Chavista, Venezuela. We want to drop a bomb on the Congress of Venezuela, although they now have two assemblies apparently, and we'll say we're going to recreate the government tomorrow. Of course, we know the same government would come up within another 5 years. It's not that easily fixed. These things are manifestations or symptoms of the underlying culture. So the question then is, what makes this part of the world so distinct that it is, like I said, 90% poorer, and not in terms of resources, actually. Many of you here, we have lots of these mining people here, you know that there are great resources in Latin America, that Venezuela has oil, Chile has copper, it's a very fertile region. It's not the lack of resources. In fact, they have excess resources relative to their population. So what has made this so permanent, these challenges? There are two main explanations, and actually I should address Catholicism. Yes, this region is Catholic, it's heavily so. but on a net benefit, it's hard to say which way, because on the one hand, the Catholic Church has pushed back against totalitarianism, but on the other, they've had this thing called liberation theology, and so in actually some instances, the Catholic Church has partnered with guerrillas, such as in Nicaragua. So there are two main explanations which I think are crucial for considering. One is the Spanish colonial record, and that is that they basically introduced a system of feudalism which actually existed in many countries right up until near the end of the 20th century. And it's called an encomienda, which is basically the Spanish crown would, say in New Zealand, the British would sell portions of land, the Spanish would sell basically governance or control of a certain portion of people, and this was kept in almost like a slave-like state up until the late 20th century, where it would be you're indebted, so it's very hard to get out of it. Anyway, so this legacy of a feudal legal system has left people with a feudal mindset, and that people don't have the self-esteem or optimism to go and be self-starters or businessmen in the way that we would want them to be, or that maybe we're more accustomed to in the Anglosphere. And Carlos Rangel, the author of that book, he explained it that people who are so accustomed to being a peasant or being ruled over wish for a more benevolent ruler and don't understand how to rule themselves. And that is still, that legacy is recent. The other one, which is more sensitive, is just that the Spanish and Latin America, it had a different group of colonizers to Canada and the United States. And also, you have to understand that although in the United States and Canada, the indigenous populations are very small, in many of these Latin countries, they're actually a majority. If you go to Bolivia or you go to Guatemala, the majority of the population are indigenous, and they just live a different way of life. You know, it's a complicated story, and if you live in Guatemala, you'll see that it's like they live a different century. You know, you might live in the same country, but you're not really interacting. And whether that's a good or bad thing, that's a complicated question, but it is the case that they have a very strong impact on the country, and it means there's not maybe a cohesive or ease of working together. And the people in these countries, throughout Latin America, in some ways, I was like the Rick Rule when I first came to Latin America. I didn't really think about race or racism at all. Once I spent basically 10 years traveling or consuming Latin America as much as possible, now I'm very aware, because there, being white or being Western is such a marker of status or wealth. And they're very aware of this. They want. And in fact, there's a saying throughout Latin America, which you can even go on it, they discuss this even on left-wing sites. It's called mejorando la raza, improving the race. If a Latin person will marry a European person, people will just say openly, oh, you're improving the race. They have this desire or positive view of the European status. Okay, so what does this all mean for the Western world? And first, I want to say that there's no real quick fix to this. If you take Guatemala as maybe a median country, the salary there is about, the GDP per capita is about $500 a month versus, let's say, $5,000 a month in the United States or Canada. So they've got 1/10. And if Guatemala were to grow at twice the rate every year, it would take 150 years for them to catch up. In other words, well, first, that's not going to happen. But second, even if they were to do that, it would be beyond my lifetime, beyond the lifetime of our children. So their poverty is basically inescapable for the near future. And so there's not an easy solution. And the policy implications, yes, I believe in free trade and I want low taxes or flat taxes, as much liberalization or open economics as we can promote, but it's not a quick fix. I had this bizarre experience when I went to Santo Domingo. I'm not sure how many people have explored Cuba, but obviously I think Cuba is a place of great pain or great suffering, right? It's basically 60 years of tyranny. However, when I went to Santo Domingo and I went just running around the city, I saw this poverty and I thought, you know what? It's not even that different from Havana. You did it you have basically replicated what they did in Cuba without a dictatorship. So I don't think policies are an easy fix. We have to accept that Latin America has its features, and they won't be changed very soon. And also, I'm very reluctant to send in social engineers to try and change this because, as we know, the US State Department is basically run by a bunch of progressives who will do more harm than good, and they won't have the sensitivity to what the people actually want. The only one good policy that has had some traction in recent times was NAFTA. We've got a Mexican guy here who mentioned that there have been positives and negatives, but in general it has helped Mexico do better. And the way my right-hand man, the guy who works with me most closely, is in Paraguay, he explained that that's a way of exporting your institutions to these countries without actually sending in military or forcing anybody. You're just basically allowing them to participate in your institutions through a free trade agreement. And so that's just one way we can help, but not necessarily change the situation entirely. And there are many other red herrings, such as the drug war. I'm against the drug war, as you might imagine, not because I think using drugs is a great idea, just because I fear it creates violence. However, the drug lords or the gangs, particularly in Central America, many people don't seem to realize that actually the majority of their business is not from selling drugs. It's from extortion. They extort everything. Avocados. My dentist in Guatemala didn't want to list her name in the phone book because she was already getting phone calls of people trying to extort her. Extortion is more profitable than selling drugs. So if you go to Acapulco, I guess you guys have been to Acapulco, some of you, half of the stores are being extorted. So the what else did I have to? Okay, so what does it mean for people who are coming, though, then? There's no way to turn back Latin Americans from coming to the United States. Many of you remember when the caravan started forming, which basically said, we're not going to hide anymore, we're just going to come in a big cluster. And Trump naturally got annoyed about this because it was embarrassing him, and he said to the Mexicans, send your military police or armed police down to the border. And actually, AMLO, the president, did send a bunch of guys down to the border with Guatemala. And what happened? Well, first, there were two gates. On the Guatemalan side, they just destroyed the gate. Okay, and they got to the second gate, to the bridge with Mexico, and there were about 100 or a lot of military police from the Mexican side. And the Guatemalans, the Hondurans, the Salvadorans, whoever, anyone in the group, they just kept on pushing. They weren't afraid. The only way to actually turn them around would be to get out your guns and start shooting them. And no one's going to do that. That's just off the table. So the fact is that the level of arbitrage, like I said, if the GDP is 10 times the level, the arbitrage is just too great to turn it around. No wall is going to stop that, even if you're concerned about the impacts or the instability of this. So, okay, I think my concern, I guess there are two concerns with the massive long-term movement of Latin America into Anglo-America is that one, not intentionally necessarily, but we are creating a permanent underclass. Because yes, many people from Latin America just go along and are actually very successful. However, there appears to be a growing underclass, and race hustlers like Jorge Ramos or these politicians or journalists who seem to like to bait them are promoting this. There's a balkanization, I think was the term used, and that I just see getting worse. The other challenge is that, and we had Sean here mentioned, the fact that there is obviously a socialist inclination among the Latin American voting bloc. This is a fact. There's no secret. We can just look at Southern California, or we can look at Puerto Rico, and this is not really disputed. The Democrats know this. They love it. I'm not saying I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I'm just saying that the socialist politicians in the United States know that the Latin American migrants are going to back them, and they're all about it. When I lived in North Carolina, the Democratic campaigners would deliberately go to the migrant communities, including amongst the illegal immigrants, and try and get them to vote. They knew they had their back. And it was a really, an eye-opening experience for me to see how they would, if there were a bunch of white South Africans lining up at the border, they wouldn't be so excited about welcoming them because they know they have a different view of the situation. They know that these Latin Americans are socialist in orientation. And if you think AOC is bad, or this Omar is bad, you just wait until you get open communists running and winning. Because that's what Latin America has. And if you go, I mean, you need to go and live in Latin America. I mean, if you go to in the middle of Colombia, their universities will have statues of Che Guevara. That's who they look up to. And Fidel Castro is the most revered leader in Latin America, or has been for the last 50 years. This is not, I don't think people realize what is coming in. Have you got a timer? Okay, fine. Okay, so, but the thing is, it's not all lost. In fact, as you may know in my work, I have 4 employees. They're spread throughout Latin America. My right-hand man is in Paraguay. I really think that the best, there are many ways to basically, we can't change the fact that Latin America is entering Anglo-America. We should just work with this. I mean, first, one of the reasons why there's an underclass is that the formal sector of business and employment is off limits to illegals. We've got to find a way to integrate them and allow them to actually participate in a more positive manner. So any kind of barriers to the legal system have to be somehow streamlined so that there can be less of an underclass. The other challenge... yeah, I mean, and another, maybe this was mentioned before by the guys discussing or debating immigration, but there's, rather than a physical wall, a wall around the welfare state is just crucial. It's like bees to honey, of course. You know, I'm an immigrant. I live in the United States now. I'm an entrepreneur and student. But if you are giving out welfare right from the get-go, I mean, the reward is crazy. I mean, I just think that's the worst way to integrate someone into your society is to basically integrate them into the welfare system right off the bat. Okay. In terms of the positive, although it is true that Latin America is this much poorer and it's not going to change quickly, limited successes are meaningful. So the positive development in Mexico's development under NAFTA, has had the effect of basically, you know, making it relative to the rest of Latin American countries or relative to Guatemala or Central America much better off. And many of you will know, I think the speaker mentioned that right now the net migration between Mexico and the United States is almost zero. So it's really just a gateway for people from other parts of Latin America to get through. So even incremental changes would be positive. And I think too, there's one other, I don't know, sensitive point which reminds me of my home country of New Zealand. In New Zealand we have Indigenous people, the Māori, and a lot of them are rural and poorer. And many social engineers want to go in and, you know, urbanize them or, you know, help them get out of this. I really think that's a terrible idea because there's a corollary there. In New Zealand, the rural Māori are the ones who have the most pride, their language, their history, the strongest families. The urban ones are the ones actually struggling in many regards. And if you go, I have this strong memory from Altavalo, Ecuador. I'm not sure if any of you guys have been there. It's a tourist hub, but basically in Altavalo, there's this proud indigenous community. They speak Quechua, they have strong families, and maybe they're not rich. You know, I still remember they were selling cheese empanadas for 10 cents each, and I was going, 10 cents, where's the profit margin in that? You know, give me 3. But so maybe they're not wealthy, but we can't measure everything in terms of the GDP. And I'm just concerned that if we go in and try and interrupt things, we'll just make things worse. So there's got to be some sensitivity there. And in some regards, I see those indigenous communities actually as more self-sufficient and they have more pride than other parts of Latin America, and I don't see a problem with that, even if they are poorer. So if there are any questions, I hope I mean, maybe we're out of time, I'm not sure, but okay, Mike, you're the man. Were you there before? Did you come in late? This is the man who's been to every country in Central and South America.
So my question is going to be strange because of that.
Sure.
Are they ever going to build a road across the Darien?
I have no idea. Sorry. That would make things a lot more convenient. You know, make things a lot more convenient. But I think once you get out of the cities of Latin America, and this is where again the tourist hubs don't really inform you as to what's going on. All these gringos who go to Latin America and think, oh, it's so lovely, and they hang out on the beach in Costa Rica or something. you don't have a clue what, go and live in the smaller towns. And if you go south of Panama City towards the border, it's like taking a time warp, right? So you have to realize that once you get out of the cities, it's just a different era, a different pace of life. So I don't see any great demand or industry pushing for a new road through there.
Fergus, thank you very much.
Okay.